Welcome and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for a special National Farm to School Network webinar, Kids Win and Farms Win, What We Know About the Impacts of Farm to School. We have got an incredible lineup of speakers for you today. My name is Lacey Stevens. I'm a program manager with the National Farm to School Network, and I'll be providing some housekeeping and an introduction to the National Farm to School Network before we turn it over to our panel to share their work with us. So a few housekeeping reminders as we're getting started here. All of our participants are in listen-only mode. Our panelists will be answering questions throughout the presentation, so please do enter those questions into the question and answer box. Note that you do have a question and answer box as well as a chat box. So for any content-related questions that you'd like our speakers to respond to, please make sure you enter those in the Q&A box. For any technical questions or technical issues, please enter those in the chat box and I'll respond to those as I'm able. Also, this webinar will be recorded and shared with you in an email follow-up. So you'll be able to review that webinar and share it out following the live presentation. So for those of you who may be joining us for the first time, the National Farm to School Network is an information, advocacy, and networking hub for communities working to bring local food sourcing, school gardens, and food and agriculture education into schools and early care and education settings across the country. Our network includes national staff, an advisory board, over 200 core and supporting partners in each state, DC, and several of the territories, as well as over 20,000 network members. And you can find out more about our network and connect with those state core and supporting partners on our website as well. I'd like to invite you to join this incredible network of partners at the 10th Biannual National Farm to Cafeteria Conference coming up next April in Albuquerque, New Mexico. This is a biannual gathering of leaders from every aspect of farm to cafeteria and an incredible opportunity for networking and growing your farm to school and farm to cafeteria experience. So you'll receive more info on that, save the date in the follow-up email as well. So when we talk about farm to school, we're talking about this broad range of activities that support the connections that communities have with fresh, healthy foods and local food producers, and all the ways that we can engage children in learning about food and agriculture. And there is no one defined program, but often includes at least one of what we call these core elements of local food procurement, gardening, and food and agriculture education. So collectively, farm to school activities empower children and their families to make informed food choices and strengthen the local economy and contributes to vibrant communities at the same time. We like to say it offers this triple win of kids win, farms win, and communities win. And today we'll be hearing from our speakers on exactly that, about what we know and what we don't know about this triple win. Our speakers today will be sharing their findings and evidence from their recent research on this topic. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to today's speakers. First, we have Becca Jablonski. She's an assistant professor and food systems extension economist in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at Colorado State University. As part of her position, Becca facilitates Colorado Governor's Food Systems Advisory Council and is a co-leader of Colorado State University's Food Systems Extension team. Dr. Jablonski's research and extension program is comprised of two primary components. The first, evaluating the farm and ranch profitability impacts of sales through non-commodity markets. And the second, in assessing the community economic impacts of food systems policies, investments, and programs. Dr. Jablonski holds a PhD from Cornell University. We also have Dawn Tilmany. She is a professor of agribusiness and extension economist with Colorado State University, serving in that role since 1997, and she became the Associate Director of CSU's Office of Community and Economic Development in 2019. She specializes in economic development related to local, organic, and other value-added food market supply chains, as well as food market analysis and consumer behavior. Her work on agricultural diversification also includes work with agritourism in Colorado and the Western US. She is a past chair of the Colorado Food Systems Advisory Council, supports the CSU Extension Food Systems and Community Development Programs, and has served on a number of advisory boards and project teams for the Colorado Department of Agriculture and the United States Department of Agriculture. We also have Melissa Flug Prescott. She is currently Assistant Professor of School and Childhood Foods and Nutrition at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She completed her PhD in Public Health at New York University and a postdoctoral fellowship at Colorado State University. Dr. Prescott is a registered dietitian nutritionist, and her past experiences include managing a school-based obesity prevention program across 7 elementary schools located in Harlem and Washington Heights, New York City. The broad focus of her research is the use of policy, systems, and environmental approaches to promote child health equity and environmental stewardship, primarily in schools and community settings. So it is my pleasure to turn it over to this incredible panel of experts, and I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Lacey, and to the entire NFSN network. We're really excited to be here today. And I would say even more excited that we've had the opportunity to partner with NFSN on the work that we're going to be presenting that we've been doing over the last almost 3 years. So of course, this is probably a slide familiar to, I would guess, everybody on this call. And much of the time when we talk about evaluating the impacts of farm to school, we sort of stop with, these are the number of school districts or kids that are participating. And what this project has really been intended to do is to dig deeper into this kids win, farmers win, communities win type of impacts that we've been hearing, not just from NFSN and our school districts and the USDA, FNS, but others. And so we've really wanted to evaluate to what extent do we know that these impacts are happening. And you can see this is the USDA AFRI grant that we've had, and our research question overall has been, what are the impacts of farm to school programs on farmers and food supply chain businesses, on household consumption patterns and school food choice, consumption, and food plate waste. So just a small question that we've been trying to answer over the last 3 years. And I just want to quickly acknowledge our entire research team. We had Melissa with us, not in the Department of Ag and Resource Economics, but in the Department of Food Science and Human Nutrition at CSU for a couple of years when we started this effort. And we're so excited that Melissa has moved on to the University of Illinois, but still gets to participate with us. And you can see the external partners and members of our advisory team, and they've been really critical in both helping us to understand some of the questions that we're trying to ask, some of the nuances around farm to school, and then really thinking about how we take some of these results we're getting and actually make them useful to a broad array of community stakeholders. So even though we've been doing work across these 3 areas, today's webinar is going to focus on results that we've had in this Kids Win and Farmers Win area of the purported benefits. I'm going to start with the Kids Win piece. And then Melissa's going to take over, and then Dawn is going to end the webinar today with the Farmers Win results. So the USDA Economic Research Service put out a report not too long ago that really gave, I think, a lot of justification about why we're so focused on schools and trying to think about some of these kids win scenarios. So what we found is that, what they found, excuse me, in their research is that SNAP households acquire almost twice as many calories from school meals than non-participant households, right? So that these calories are very important for low-income households. Schools are also the only acquisition location where SNAP households had a higher nutrition score than non-SNAP households. They measure this using the Healthy Eating Index. And so you can see that actually for these low-income households, that participating in the school meals is actually going to improve the HEI score on average of the household, compared to, it may actually decrease it for some of the non-SNAP households, but for SNAP households, this seems to be particularly important. Students participating in the National School Lunch Program and the School Breakfast Program meals get a lot of their daily calories from schools. You can see the breakdown here. I'm just going over this quickly, but I think, again, it helps to justify why we're so focused on the Kids Win piece in schools. And lastly, there's some research that suggests that the National School Lunch Program may reduce food insecurity, right? Especially given some of those earlier slides about how much calories these SNAP household kids are getting through these school meals. So understanding all of this, right, we want to understand what is the particular role that farm to school plays in impacting kids, right? So what are the activities that can be successfully implemented to support kids, right? Do we know that local procurement has an impact or a bigger impact than, say, experiential learning or nutrition education or promotion activities or school gardens? And this becomes very important because as schools, as you all know, have limited budgets and they also have limited resources, particularly in terms of their time, understanding which of these types of activities are the most successful or are likely to lead to the best outcomes within kids is really important, right? Or understanding if there's particular interaction effects. So our partners on this project, Alessandro Bonanno and Sucinta Mendez, have been working on a study that's currently under review in a journal. And one of the things that they've been really interested in looking at is that, as you probably know, we have 2 years of the farm to school census. And so they've been trying to understand why there's schools that may have participated in the first farm to school census, but actually then dropped out and did not participate in the second farm to school census. And what you can see here is that there's about 7,000 school districts that could be matched between the two censuses out of about 10,000, right? And they found that almost 3,000 school districts had farm to school programs in that first census, and that about 30% decided not to participate in the second census, right? So we actually see a significant number of these school districts that are deciding for some reason not to participate. And so one of the things that they looked at were, are there some activities that are more likely to be associated with continuation or with discontinuation? And what I think is really interesting is they found all activities are associated with continuation except one. And that one is actually the farm trips, right? Taking these visits out to visit the farm. And, you know, when you think about it, we don't have the evidence within the farm to school census to say this exactly, but our hypothesis is that you have to have resources to go and actually get a bus to go out to the school, to go out to the farms. And so that maybe by virtue of some of those additional barriers to do that, that it makes it more likely that a school would be less likely to participate in farm to school moving forward. Another interesting thing that they found that is likely in line with what I think many of you are probably already thinking is that the share of school districts, this is looking at the share of school districts that continued versus discontinued, and the more activities in which a school participated, the more likely they are to continue, right? So that if they're doing more farm to school activities, they're more likely to continue participating in farm to school. And so now we actually have evidence of that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Melissa.
Thanks, Becca. So given the large national interest in farm to school, it's really important to better understand the effectiveness of farm to school programs. And so what we did is we did a systematic literature review to better address that question. So since there's very limited studies specifically on farm to school programs, we decided to examine what's known about farm to school related activities. So we used the last 2 farm to school census to determine what constitutes a farm to school activity, and we used that in our search strategy when we were searching for what has already been published on this topic. So we limited our systematic review to interventions that were focused on kindergarten to 12th grade, anywhere within that range in the US, and schools participating in the National School Lunch Program. So we included all farm to school studies that exist, which as long as they were peer reviewed and featured original research. So that was 7 studies as it shows in the bottom there. And then we also included all the relevant farm to school related activity studies as long as they had a comparison or a control group. So that was 14 studies. Next slide, please. So this figure shows, it's a Euler diagram that shows how much overlap in the farm to school activity categories there were in the 21 included studies. So just to orient you a bit to this figure, the color code at the bottom, it gives what each color means, and the big number in the figure is the N, so how many studies are constituted in each of the circles, and then the smaller number corresponds to the figure at the bottom. So that large the largest circle with the number 6 in it, there were 6 promotion activities. So what this figure shows us is that the studies, the research currently available consists of a lot of multi-component studies. So for example, there's studies that are doing procurement as well as school gardens, or procurement as well as an integrated curriculum. And so while that's great in terms of trying to make a difference in the schools, but in terms of trying to understand what's effective and what's not, a lot of this, the majority of this study, since they were multi-component, made it difficult to understand which particular component is most effective or was most responsible for any outcomes that were measured. And the other thing to gather from this figure is that nutrition promotion activities were the most common type of farm to school activity. So that could be things like doing some kind of smarter lunchroom intervention, some kind of social marketing or promotion, either promoting healthy foods in general or promoting local foods in particular. So things like the harvest of the month, those types of promotion activities would be in that category. Next slide, please. And so the main findings were that there was consistent evidence that farm to school programming is associated with increased nutrition related knowledge. And we also saw a lot of evidence that farm to school related activities and farm to school programs help improve healthy food selection as well as nutrition self-efficacy. So that would mean improving kids' confidence in their ability to make nutritious food choices, as well as their willingness to try fruits and vegetables. But there wasn't consistent evidence in regards to the role of farm to school activities and fruit and vegetable consumption or fruit and vegetable preferences. And just in general, some of the main limitations of the current research on farm to school programs is just few studies evaluated the implementation fidelity or the actual dose of the intervention. So in many of these studies, we're not really sure, for example, if they set out to do 5 nutrition education lessons, did all 5 of them actually get implemented, or how long were these interventions? And so without having that specific information, it's hard to understand what the real impact is, since there's seems to be a lot of variation in what was actually done. And so that is a barrier also because we don't really understand what's feasible, since we're not really sure what was actually able to be implemented in the schools. Next slide, please. So I briefly just wanted to mention, this is actually from a different USDA grant that that was also set in Colorado. But this Healthy Planet, Healthy Youth study was a food systems education and promotion intervention where we were trying to improve diet quality and food waste among middle school students. And so we used an existing curriculum called Farm to Table and Beyond, which is tied to 6th grade science standards. And so we worked with science teachers at 2 middle schools to implement 5 units from this curriculum. And at the end of the units, the students in the classes were challenged to teach their peers about what they learned. So they made these posters. And then our team did a content analysis of the posters to come up with what we should include in a social marketing or a promotion about the food system, and basically using the content from whatever the kids thought was important. And so we measured our success for this intervention with both surveys and plate waste. And to get at that question about what's feasible, what can we do to try and make sure that these types of classroom interventions are sustained over time, we also included teacher interviews to understand from their perspective what was feasible, what wasn't, and what were key implementation factors that contributed to their success of actually implementing the program. Next slide, please. And so those posters at the bottom are the ones that we did after the content analysis based on the kids' actual work. So the main findings from this study was that the intervention group increased their fruit and vegetable consumption relative to baseline, while the control group actually decreased their fruit and vegetable consumption, which we were happy to see. And another positive finding was that the intervention group wasted less fruits and vegetables over the course of the year, and whereas the control group did not. And this finding was driven primarily by differences in how much salad bar items were wasted. And this makes sense because, you know, students have the most control of, you know, the volume of salad bar items they put on their plate. So it makes sense that this was what was driving those changes. And in terms of the implementation metrics, the teachers reported that having a curriculum that was aligned to the academic standards was really important. Another important thing was that we didn't just hand them this big curriculum and expect them to do it. We gave them an outline that said, if you run out of time, these are the parts you should cut, but make sure you cover this part of it. And so they really appreciated that. And they also said it was essential to have the freedom to adapt the intervention, which as a researcher, that's hard because you want to make sure that, you know, ideally things would be implemented the same way everywhere. But in schools, it just seems like that may not be feasible. And so that's why the component of intervention fidelity. So as long as you know what adaptations were changed, what things were changed, then you can try and control for that statistically and better understand what works and what doesn't. So that's that study in a nutshell, but I'm happy to answer questions. And that link right there on this slide is a link to the study. So I'll turn it back over to you, Don and Becca.
Thanks so much, Melissa. And that's the perfect lead in to another aspect of the research that we did in the AFRI grant. You know, as you heard from Melissa, doing research and evaluation in school settings is really difficult, right? It's really hard to ensure that teachers are implementing certain protocol in similar type ways. As many of you, I'm sure, already know, it's difficult to get time in the classroom given competing needs, right? You need a control school, and that's one of the things that we tried to pay a lot of attention to in the systematic literature review that Melissa presented. But it's difficult, right? Because you don't want to favor some schools in a district over another, and you need to get some school that, you know, is similar in terms of demographics and other characteristics. The willingness of teachers to participate, I think we already touched on, but you know, even if the principal is excited about what you're doing, individual teachers may not implement something in the same way. And then lunch is fast. I know I've been looking at what's happening in my daughter's school right now, and I think they have about 15 minutes, you know, including through going through the lunch line, right? And there's many factors that impact what kids eat in the school setting. I remember that Melissa, one time when we were starting to work together, showed us some agent-based modeling work she was doing that was looking at how the number of students that are sitting at a table impact what kids eat, right? So there's so many factors that are going to affect kids eat that all of these things make it very, very difficult to do research and evaluation in a school setting. So that being said, we tried to do some research in the school setting. What we were trying to do was really focus on 4 products, and we wanted to look at how consumption of those products by kids varied if the product was conventional, so basically not labeled in any way as local, if it was local but not labeled in any way as local, or if it was local with an information treatment, so it's identified as local. And Marco Costanigro, who led up this component of the project, had a really good idea that instead of doing the research in the cafeteria, because there's all of these competing things happening in the lunchroom, that what we would actually do is focus on the fresh fruit and vegetable program. And so we really liked this idea because students are given the option of taking a fresh fruit or vegetable item or not taking it. And then they have a choice about how much they consume of it, right? And so it's a very sort of straightforward choice. And our hypothesis was that if an item was labeled as local, that students might be more likely to take it, but depending on the quality of the product, right, if it tasted good, essentially, they would be lesser likely to consume more of it. And so here on the right, you can see what some of the information was that we provided to the classrooms. Now, because of that issue that I was mentioning about not being able to control exactly what the teacher would do in the classroom, so we couldn't be guaranteed that the teacher would show the students this information and read a little blurb on the back about the farm. We made sure to label every single item, right? The FFVP items are all labeled. They're all packaged individually, and we labeled each and every one with a Colorado Proud sticker, which we got thanks to a partnership with our Colorado Department of Agriculture. So what we tried to do was to vary when products were going to be served and in the products in different schools, and we also wanted to vary if schools got a local item first or a local labeled item versus a conventional, right? So that we could control for, did a school actually receive only like local items first or conventional, right? We could sort of deal with that. Unfortunately, even though we had perhaps the greatest partners that you could have at the school district level, there were some challenges, logistical challenges in terms of the supply chain that really created some challenges in our experiment. So things that were sort of non-fatal was that the same product was delivered to all schools each day. And we also had 2 schools dropped out. So we ended up with 4 schools and 86 classrooms participating. The things that we think are more fatal flaws in the experiment is that the experiment ended up taking a long period of time. So if you look here, we started on October 2nd of 2018. We didn't finish until December 20th, 2018. And for any of you who are actually working in these schools, you know that getting close to that holiday break, right, that there's some differences in how people eat and what they're eating that we really couldn't control for. We also received most of the conventional items closer to that winter break mark. So the supply chain just kept delivering local products, even if we were told that they were going to be non-local, and there really wasn't much we could do about that. And we were unfortunately not able to get a local identified pepper product. When we had the first local pepper product, we actually had to send students to the schools to help. What the school district told us was that cutting up the peppers, because we couldn't get pre-sliced peppers from the local supply chain, added 60 hours of work to them. So we had to bring students in to do that. And unfortunately, by the time the students sliced up the peppers, they were packaged up and they were delivered to the schools, it was about 2 to 3 days later. And so the item really wasn't good anymore. And then we were not able to get the last tomato treatment, which is the local non-identified, due to some weather challenges that happened in 2018. So I don't really want to spend a lot of time on the findings because we do think that there are these challenges, but I'll at least tell you that preliminarily, if we just focus on tomatoes, and we just focus on tomatoes because it's the one item where we had a relatively short period of time between the conventional and local identified. And even though we were missing that local non-identified, we did have the local identified and conventional. So we used that and tried to do some additional econometric analysis with this. But the preliminary findings, we see no significant differences in the waste weight when the tomatoes are identified as local. And we actually see significant and negative differences in consumption. So what we're now trying to do is a follow-on survey where we can actually focus on a smaller subsample of the same students and try to do more of these taste tests. So stay tuned. We hope to have more results soon. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dawn to talk about what we've learned about Farmers Win from Farm to School.
Thank you, Becca. And kind of really this topic has already been set up a little bit. Of course, when we first started to talk about Farmer School, feels like decades ago now, you know, one of the value propositions was, well, this would be a great market channel for farmers. But as we just saw in some of the last results, it's not clear that it really is affecting the procurement choices nor the consumption patterns of students as much as we'd like to believe. But we also believe that in addition to it being a potential market, that there's lots of ways a farmer could win just for it raising awareness and being almost like a public relations campaign for a really important part of our society, which is our youth who are developing their food habits. So with that, we wanted to be really careful about how we looked at how farmers and ranchers might benefit from farm to school. And, you know, there's a lot of ways that farmers can benefit. The market could be increasing its prices, although for most of us who've done business with schools, they aren't our highest profit margin markets because of the budgetary pressures they have. But in other cases, it may allow producers to scale up because all of a sudden they have a place to put wholesale volumes of sales. And in other cases, it could be that it's creating a market for seconds. For instance, one example in our state is that we did not realize there was such a discount on potatoes that weren't of that big baked potato size in the fresh market, but for school kids, a smaller potato might be better. So that's all to say, what we really want to explore is whether having farm to school in your community seems to have some bottom line benefit for farmers. And as you start thinking about that, it's a fairly hard thing to disentangle. Maybe not if you're looking at one school district and know all the farmers that are working with that district, but we are again trying to do this at a national level. So again, this is motivated by the fact that if you look at the farm to school policy that has passed both at the national level and in some of our states. Local procurement has always been at the heart of that, with this intention, again, we think, of opening up a market access opportunity for all farmers, but even some of those really focus on local farms or small and mid-sized farms or beginning farms. But those are always also complemented with this food and agricultural education and school garden activities that we mentioned before among those 14 categories of activities that happen. So even though we originally sought out to think, well, local procurement and schools buying from farms is the way they win, we decided to make a framework where farmers could just win from general farm to school education programming going on, because it might build some goodwill or some awareness or visibility for buying locally, even if it's not all procured directly through the schools, but it might be driving people to join CSAs or visit farmers markets, or there's a lot of ways they could benefit. Because as we know, really schools have pretty limited food budgets, so that procurement piece certainly can be a win, but we don't expect it would be the only win that we might have. And as many of us on the call also realized, is that budget that they face also can be significantly affected by the percentage of free and reduced children in that school district. And even though, again, we've had some changing policy dynamics around how much that reimbursement rate is, we still all know that the amount of money that really will likely flow to farmers is not going to be as significant as we probably originally intended there to be. And plus, it's not going to be at price points that are going to be even competitive with a lot of the other options they have, including farmers markets and sales to higher profit margin outlets. But again, another win that we could look at is it may not need to be higher price points or a lot of money, but if it allows a product that, because it wasn't grade A or a first, as we might call them, but has just minor flaws, that we, instead of having that sent to a landfill or composted, we can find a good market for it in a school. That might be a great opportunity for our producers. And it may not even be flaws, like I said, whether it's potatoes or apples. It may be that the school market can actually handle a smaller size than the retail market would want. So to take one step back on how we frame this as economists, is there is a great group in the country called Ag of the Middle that focuses a lot on the fact that we had a missing middle class in agriculture. We had very small, almost boutique producers who are mostly going to farmers markets and doing almost artisanal produce. And they were a stark contrast to that lower right-hand corner commodity producer who had secured lots of acres and resources to do very high volumes of sales with very low margins in our more traditional food channels. But we found there were struggles for people in either one of those, either with commodities of the margins being too low or in the direct markets of the volume being too low. And so that group, the Ag of the Middle, has very much been a proponent for value-based food chains. And so what you might see someone in the direct marketing category graduate to is that they would keep some of those great direct markets where they have those great customer interactions, but they'd also have some opportunities to do some higher volume wholesale sales with like-minded, value-driven wholesale accounts like farm to school or through food hubs, which might service farm to school. And so this is a conceptual way to think of all the different choices farmers have of how they're going to sell their products. And you can see where we feel the child nutrition programs might fit in that paradigm. And if you want more information about work we've done on looking at the financial performance of different business models that farmers are looking at, we have a whole website devoted to that, but we didn't want to focus our time on that today. But so that if any of you have questions about what we've done with particularly focused at small and mid-sized farms and direct and intermediate markets, there's a lot you can learn. And one of the projects we did that was specifically not national, which we're going to talk about today, but here in Colorado, is something Becca led on actually looking at profit margins within these channels. The reason that's important for this discussion is that we need to know if we're going to be guiding producers to do perhaps sales for farm to school through these what we call intermediate channels, where they're not directly seeing the person who will consume their food, but they're doing business with an organization like a school or a chef or a hospital that's going to be preparing it, but probably having some information about the farm it comes from, is we need to make sure that there's still good profitability there. And so we, with a set of 50 producers here in Colorado, did a very deep dive into their financial performance in these markets. And what we saw is that in these intermediated markets, they actually, in surprisingly, get a better profit margin in these intermediated channels than they even get in their farmers markets, because even though the farmers markets might have higher price points, the cost of servicing those markets is so high, particularly in labor and transportation, and for a relatively lower volume of sales, that we want to encourage producers to go this direction. But this was our first attempt to make sure when we were giving that advice that we could show them there was good profitability to be had. And so this was a project about 5 years ago now, which has been a building block to us having the idea to do this national study. So the reason that's important for this discussion about farm to school is you can see here when we looked at the supply chains used by school districts, I believe this is from the census, is that those same common supply chains, distributors, the individual food producer getting the product to them themselves, those main two are those intermediated markets we just looked at in the Colorado study, and what we're going to continue to look at as we scale up to the national level now. So when we decided to look at how farm to school programs resulted in different profitability outcomes for farmers, we needed some way to integrate that activity into the model. And so that farm to school index was created from the graph you saw earlier, where up to 14 different activities could be taken on for a school. We, for every school district, then created a farm to school index for the county that they're residing in. And that is compared to the number of school districts in that county. And so we kind of almost made a new locational specific variable of that, a farm being in an area that has either a very high level of farm to school activity or low farm to school activity may affect them. Again, this is very different than what you might think of, where we just give a farmer credit for actually doing sales to a school district. We're saying even without the farmer doing sales to a school district, if they're in an area where those farm to school activities happen, raise awareness, raise our literacy, raise our education about the importance of foods, it could still benefit a farmer even if they don't have a direct market relationship. That's a decision we made to be as broad as possible, but we'll show you other ways that you still could get more benefit by doing local sales. And then we did something that makes us sound far more clever than we probably are, but we did something called unconditional quantile regression. This is the idea that we didn't want farmers to be treated as average. We know there is a very diverse set of producers out there. So we broke them into groups based on their performance, almost like we used to do in our own school classrooms. We have high performing farms, average performing farms, and farms that are actually struggling right now profitability wise. And we look at how these effects differ across those groups. So what we did with a data set that the U.S. Department of Agriculture keeps, that is an augmentation to the census that farms fill out every 5 years. They also pick about 17,000 farms or so a year to do a deep dive financial survey we call ARMS, the Ag Resource Management Survey, and we're one of the few schools who gets access to that. We could go and look at farms' financial performance in that group of 17,000 a year, and we have a few years to look at. And we could actually do a very typical ag financial performance model, and we'll build off that here a little bit. But what we really want to focus on today is where we added, in addition to that usual farm financial model we would do as economists, we added this farm to school intensity index, and then try to look at what some of the effects from this programming might be on farms. And to cut to the chase, and then I'll show you how we arrived at this, we did see that farm to school activity levels in an area have a positive influence on the operating profit margins of farms in that area, particularly if they're already performing well. So that's good news in the fact that we're supporting and helping farms do well. We'd love to see also that it's supporting farms that are struggling, but what we find instead is that it's those local food assets like having farmers markets and having food hubs that are more important for those low performing farms. And as you might guess, they might go hand in hand, because having a food hub may be the way one of those small farms gets access to it. So again, this is a very location specific finding. We looked at the activity level in a county, and then if a farmer in that county was doing better because of that activity level. And overall, we found, and this was driven by our more traditional farm performance model, scale is very important. How big a farm is really what's driving a lot of the profitability. Although that size can be measured in two ways. The impact we found was on if a farm was a very high sales level, it didn't help them actually to own a lot of land and be big in a capital resource way. And so that's actually interesting in and of itself, but not really the focus of today. So what I try to do for a fairly complex model is summarize this down to a table. And so what I did is, even though we looked across actually 7 categories, I broke this into 3 categories of farmers. Those who are at the 25th quintile or below, so they're really struggling. They're among the lowest 25% of financially performing farms. We have our average farms, those at the 50th percentile who are doing exactly what an average farmer does. And then we have those high flying farms who are really strong at the 90th percentile and above. And so for each one of these results, we could look at the individual result for them. And I'm not going to go through all of these because that would take too long. But obviously the one we're most worried about is that top line is, how does farm to school intensity influence performance? And what again is a good sign is that it is supporting a large chunk of our farmers, particularly everyone in the 50th percentile and above. That might not have been our real policy mission. We might have hoped this was going to help those farms that are struggling. But what it really is a good message for is across your ag community, whether it's people doing direct markets or more traditional ag, this is a win for farmers. And whether it's because it's the public relations aspect of it, the education aspect, the awareness aspect, this is a really good sign for all of those people in the ag community who are supporters of this program, is that they had a reason to support it. It's been good for our farms. But a lot of the more traditional things matter too. I'm going to spend less time on them, but not surprisingly, it continues to be important how big a farm is in sales, on how well they're doing financially. The one other thing we wanted to point to down towards the bottom of this slide is that for those lower performing farms that are struggling right now, what's really helping them is having food hubs and farmers markets in their area. Now that might have some relationship to the farm to school intensity index, but really to look at that, we have to go a little bit deeper, which I'll do next. I know I covered a lot fast here, and this paper is not yet written up. You're seeing it hot off the presses, but this is the type of work we're trying to do, and it's a little challenging. So now we can take and kind of graph some of the same thing. So again, what you want to look for here is, this is how we divided farms by where they're doing their sales. So the blue line is that they're doing any local food sales at all, but then we disentangled that from those farmers in the orange line that are doing direct to consumer sales. They're going to the farmers markets or having a CSA. Those with the gray line that only do intermediated sales through those more wholesale channels. But we also, the yellow line shows we also have a lot of farmers who are doing both. And what you see here is that those in local markets are actually struggling more to be high performing farms. And so when we see a higher share of people in local markets in our lower percentile market channel, in our lower percentile performance channels, that's actually not good for the local food movement. It basically says, it almost puts people at a disadvantage to be in local markets because none of them tend to be performing as well. And this really has less to do with the farm to school aspect. So let's switch gears and look at that. Now, if we had the farm to school intensity concept, some of those farms are doing better if you consider both whether they're doing local food sales and whether there's a lot of farm to school activities going on in their state. Now you'll see that there is some of those local food, direct to consumer, intermediated farms that are up in that 75th, 90th, and 95th percentile and benefiting from having farm to school being done in their area. And even though those lines look really close to zero, that's 3, 5, 7%. And when you're talking about profit margins, 3, 5, and 7% increases are not insignificant at all. And so this is, again, a very complex way to tell this story, but we felt it was a very important way to tell a story, because if we just only focused on average producers, we were missing a lot of the subtleties of how this is working for farms across the spectrum. So the real takeaway from this is that We really see farm to school programming as another local food ecosystem dynamic that could be affecting farmers' choices, the strategies they're making, and the financial performance. And this is particularly important in an era where commodity prices are really struggling for producers, and we're looking for other ways to show them that their local and regional markets might be part of their solution. And particularly since scale is a major driver of financial performance, and that some of the biggest farms are still doing the best, but showing them some of these results to see that even if they're not participating actively, they may be indirectly benefiting from farm to school going on in their area, from the sheer public relations aspect of what it might mean for their markets. But we also see it's a complement to more traditional local farm assets, and that some of those farms still do need the farmers markets and food hubs to be their real market solution, whereas farm to school might be for those producers who have got their business processes down or have scaled up to a point that that makes sense for them. But all of it, and you can see there's a lot of detail here, shows that we think we're onto something, and that we need to do a lot more work to disentangle how this is working for farmers and school districts. And so even though this is a very national overview of that, we think it should motivate all of you who are working in your own districts and your own areas to look at how you can make this a win for farms. It gives you, I think, a nice justification to move forward to do that, because that story is going to play out very differently in different places. So again, we hope we covered some of this well enough that you have some take-home messages for today. But we also house all this information in two places. One is one I already mentioned, localfoodeconomics.com, which is our national community of practice for people who do work on the economics of food systems at the US level. And then here at Colorado State, we have our own site, foodsystems.colorado-state.edu, that instead of being focused on just economics is focused on all of the fields that support food systems at CSU, including Melissa's former department over at Food Science, Human Nutrition. And so we will have this information posted and links to this information at both of those sites. And we welcome you to visit them to learn more. Or as always, contact us directly as you have questions. I wish we had some of our results a little more formally done, but again, you're getting it hot off the presses. So we plan to have these out in publications in the next year or two, but just keep in touch with us and we'll make sure you have whatever we have done at your disposal, because we should have given you your network a credit a long time ago. This whole grant from USDA was catalyzed by your network coming and asking us to help you figure out economic impacts, and me and Becca answering that would take far more work than we could do in the 2 months that they wanted to look at it. So it kind of inspired Becca to go ahead and lead a group of us to actually put this grant together. So really, so many of the ideas we presented today really were spearheaded from your organization asking questions we couldn't answer at the time. And even though we've answered some of them now, it's only made us have about 10 times more questions to ask. So you've given us a career worth of work, and thank you for that. With that, I'll turn it back over to Becca.
Oh yeah, there's a couple questions that I think have to do with some of the research that's out of, especially around food security impacts. So I don't know that there's anything that's specific that's out there right now, but I do encourage you to take a look at the paper that Melissa mentioned that we just published, and we have the citation on the slides that Lacey will send out. You know, we really did a very thorough process there and have tried to include information on exactly who the population is that's sampled. So even if some of the research is not disaggregated based on the specific effects to low-income households, it will show you for the households that are part of that school district, like what percentage are eligible for free and reduced, as an example. And also just to keep in mind that, you know, consumption is just the other end of food waste. So I just want to remind everybody that those things are intrinsically linked. And so with that, we can turn it back over to Lacey.
Thank you so much, this incredible panel. And I want to thank you all, not just for this webinar, but for your ongoing partnership and really exploring in a meaningful and really impactful way what the impacts of farm to school are. And I think that I'm sure everyone on the call really sees today how it's so vital to have this kind of research, not just to see what the impacts are, but so we can better implement farm to school in a way that maximizes those benefits for kids, for farmers, and for communities. So we're really thrilled to have the opportunity to work and partner with CSU and look forward to continuing to delve into those important questions. As our panelists have mentioned, there is still a lot of information that'll be coming out of this research and papers and publications. And so we'll be sure that all of that information goes out through the National Farm to School Network, and our network has access to that. Again, you will be receiving a follow-up email with a recording, as well as links to the publications that Melissa mentioned, and slides for this webinar as well. I do want to take this opportunity also to remind folks that the next iteration of the USDA Farm to School Census is open. So if you are a school district or you work with a school district, please make sure that your district is responding to that. As you can see, the information garnered from that census is really vital on so many levels to help us understand what's happening across the country, and to be able to utilize it in research like this to better understand the impacts of farm to school. So I cannot emphasize enough the importance of making sure that we get as many districts as possible responding to that USDA census. So with that, again, a huge thank you to our speakers today. Thank you all for spending your afternoon with us and for your interest and your ongoing interest in both farm to school and this important farm to school research. We hope you have a great afternoon. And again, we hope to see you in New Mexico next April to talk further and expand on our farm to school work together. Have a great day, everybody.